The studio lights blazed, illuminating one of America's most watched talk shows. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation as JD Vance, the newly inaugurated Vice President of the United States, stepped onto the set. Fresh from taking his oath of office, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to prove. But Marcus Bennett, the show's host, had other plans. Bennett, known for his sharp tongue and left-leaning rhetoric, had been preparing for this moment for weeks. The producer had assured Vance's team that this would be a respectful discussion about the new administration. But one look at the glint in Bennett's eyes told a different story. Vance, a Marine veteran, could sense an ambush from a mile away. Every instinct told him that the questions coming his way were laced with hidden traps. The first one came wrapped in a smile. "Mr. Vice President," Bennett began, his voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Let's talk about your remarkable journey, from a Trump critic to his second in command." Vance returned a measured smile, his eyes reflecting the wisdom of hard-fought life lessons. "You know, Marcus, that's actually a perfect place to start," he replied, "because it speaks to something bigger than politics. It speaks to the American capacity for growth and understanding." The audience leaned forward, surprised by his lack of defensiveness. Bennett shifted in his chair, his carefully rehearsed follow-up suddenly losing its edge. "Growth and understanding," he mocked. "Some might call it political convenience." Vance didn't flinch. "You see, Marcus," he said, "in America, we cherish the right to change our minds when presented with new information. When I criticized the president years ago, I was looking through a narrow lens. But then I saw something remarkable. I saw his policies actually helping the forgotten Americans I wrote about in my book." A flicker of tension passed over Bennett's face. "Let me ask you something, Marcus," Vance continued. "Have you ever changed your mind about something important? Have you ever looked at the evidence and realized your first judgment might have been wrong?" The pause that followed lingered a beat too long. "We're here to talk about your changes, Mr. Vice President, not mine," Bennett snapped, shuffling his cards. A clash of convictions. Bennett pounced again. "Speaking of changes, let's discuss your recent speech at the National Prayer Breakfast. You spoke about divine guidance in government decisions. Don't you think that's a dangerous mix of church and state?" The audience tensed. He had just stepped onto sacred ground. Vance, however, was ready. "Divine guidance, Marcus?" he said, leaning forward. "What I actually said was that our founding fathers understood the importance of moral guidance in leadership. They weren't afraid of faith. They were afraid of tyranny." A ripple of amen echoed from the crowd. Bennett clenched his jaw. Surely, in our modern, diverse society, Vance raised a hand, cutting him off, not rudely, but firmly. "Let me finish this thought, because it's important," he said. "When I took my oath of office, I placed my hand on the Bible, just as presidents and leaders have done throughout our nation's history. Not because we're establishing a state religion, but because we recognize that our rights come from God, not merely from government." A few audience members clapped. Bennett glanced at his producer, who was watching intently from the sidelines. Then Vance added, "You know what's interesting, Marcus? When I was a Marine, nobody questioned our chaplain's presence. Nobody mocked prayer before a mission. Because in those moments of truth, even the skeptics understood. Some things are bigger than politics." The turning point. Bennett's face flushed. "Let's move on to your relationship with President Trump," he said, trying to regain control. "You recently said he was God's instrument for America's renewal. Don't you think that's a bit extreme?" Vance smiled slightly. "What I think is extreme," he said, his voice steady, "is how some in the media seem more concerned about a leader who prays than about policies that actually help American families." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "But since you brought up President Trump," Vance continued, Let's talk about results instead of rhetoric. Let's talk about what's really happening in our communities. For the first time, Bennett had no immediate response. His trademark interruptions were momentarily subdued by Vance's steady presence. Let's talk about your background. Bennett tried again. You've written about your humble beginnings, yet now you're sitting in the halls of power. Some might say you've forgotten where you came from. Vance didn't miss a beat. That's interesting, Marcus, he said, because where I come from, we judge people by their character, not by how well they fit the Washington elite's expectations. Bennett scoffed. Character? Is that what you call this complete reversal on Trump? You once wrote quite passionately against him. Vance nodded. Yes, I did. And you know what takes character? Admitting when you're wrong. Standing up for what you believe in, even when people like you try to twist it into something else. The audience erupted in applause. Bennett tugged at his collar. You've built your reputation as a voice for working-class Americans. Yet here you are in an expensive suit defending a billionaire. Don't you see the irony? The temperature in the room dropped. Some audience members shifted uncomfortably. But Vance remained unshaken. You know what I see, Marcus, he said, his voice calm. I see someone who thinks an expensive suit can change a man's values. But let me tell you something. The values I learned from my grandmother in Middletown, Ohio, they don't change with a zip code or a job title. Bennett's expression darkened. So you're saying your transformation has nothing to do with political ambition? That we should just ignore your past criticisms and accept that you're now President Trump's puppet? A stunned silence fell over the studio. Vance let the word hang for a moment. Then he smiled, a slow, knowing smile. You know, Marcus, that word says more about you than it does about me. The audience leaned in. In your world, loyalty to someone you respect is something to mock. But let me tell you what I learned as a Marine. Vance's voice took on a steel edge. In combat, you judge a person's character by their actions, not by what the media says about them. I've seen President Trump's character firsthand, not the caricature you and your colleagues have created. The audience erupted in applause. Bennett tried to interject, but Vance pressed on. You call it being a puppet. I call it recognizing true leadership when I see it. And yes, I'm proud to serve alongside President Trump. Bennett's face paled. His carefully orchestrated ambush had backfired, and the audience knew it. Vance straightened his tie. The American people are tired, he said. Tired of being mocked for their faith. Tired of being ridiculed for their values. Tired of journalists who think their job is to tell people what to think instead of reporting the truth. The audience rose to their feet in a thunderous standing ovation. As JD Vance walked off the set, Marcus Bennett sat in stunned silence. What was meant to be an ambush had turned into something else entirely, an undeniable moment of truth.